the just shall live by faith. Luther came to understand the gospel in Romans 1. He was able to compare his discovery with the rest of Scripture from memory precisely because he had spent so many years carefully reading and teaching the Bible. And that's immediately why he knew, wait a minute, a whole new window opened up to him. He understood that phrase, the righteousness of God in the New Testament, it does not describe that character or that quality within God that's responsible for the judgment of guilty sinners. No, it describes the righteousness that God gives to guilty sinners by faith. And when Luther understood that, it changed everything for him. Suddenly he realized that the righteousness of God was not there to condemn him, but the righteousness of God received by faith was there to justify him. And just as much as before, his brilliant legal mind led him to know that he was absolutely a guilty sinner who had very little hope of salvation. Now his legal mind helped him to understand that if God said he was justified by his righteousness, then he was certainly justified. This is how Luther puts it in a very, very wonderful and dramatic statement. He says, my situation was that although an impeccable monk, I stood before God as a sinner troubled in conscience, and I had no confidence that my merit would satisfy him. Night and day I pondered until I saw the connection between the justice of God and the statement, the just shall live by faith. Then I grasped the truth that the righteousness of God is that righteousness whereby, through grace and sheer mercy, He justifies us by faith. Therefore I felt myself to be reborn and to have gone through open doors into paradise. This passage of Paul became to me a gateway into heaven. There it was right there. At that moment or sometime along that place, you could say that Martin Luther was born again. As he says, he felt himself going through open doors into paradise, a gateway into heaven. Now you can really say that this, right here, this is where the Reformation began. Because as much as anything, what Martin Luther was a man who was profoundly changed. When you contrast him with his absolutely guilt-ridden torment, again, not fostered in his mind because of some theological or psychological sickness, but because he understood theology, he understood himself, and he had the legal brilliance to figure out that the two resulted in him going straight to hell. But when he understood this biblical truth that basically, we must say, had been lost by medieval theologians, as he said, it was like the doors of heaven opening up to him. Again, let's remember, what was the medieval Roman Catholic conception? Some might argue it's the present Roman Catholic conception as well, but let's just talk about it in the historical framework. What was the Roman Catholic framework for how a person is saved? You're saved by the church, right? The church dispenses grace to you for salvation. And how does the church dispense this grace to you? Through the sacraments, right? And therefore, all you have to do is receive these outward sacraments, and you can know that you are saved. But the problem is people recognize the disconnect, right? They recognized, here's an utterly wicked, ungodly man. His life is filled with corruption, and he shows very little regard for God. But you know what? He was baptized. He takes communion. He goes to confession every once in a while. You know, he has enough of the sacraments to be able to say, well, I'm going to heaven. But you look at his life, and there's no evidence of any kind of change of life or love of God or trust of God. But according to that medieval Roman Catholic framework, well, he's going to heaven. You check off the boxes, this sacrament, this sacrament, this sacrament. Apparently he's received enough grace, he's going to heaven. But how do you reconcile that with a life that seems utterly unchanged? These big theological questions were the ones that tormented Luther, and why you see that his understanding, quite accurately, of the biblical idea of justification by faith. And by the way, by faith alone. This ends up being the big distinction. We'll talk about that a little bit more later, but I should just touch on it now. if you were to ask a Roman Catholic back in Luther's day, or even today, are you justified by faith? They would say, absolutely yes. The issue isn't between justified by faith or not justified by faith. The issue is, are you justified by faith alone? And to that, the Roman Catholic theologian or the Roman Catholic person who understood their doctrine could not answer, yes, I am saved by faith alone. Well, this was the huge turning point for Martin Luther. And this was the spiritual revolution that took place within him that enabled him to do the amazing things that God used him to do within the Reformation. And so that's the beginning story of Martin Luther. In our next lecture, we're going to talk about what he did after this point and how he came to what I would call the flashpoint of the Reformation, the whole issue over the selling of indulgences. We'll consider that together, as I said, in our next lecture together.